Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, as-salatu as-salam ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to another exciting session of webinar with us with Nida Trust. And thank you very much for joining us today. I know that this session is supposed to be on Wednesday, but unfortunately we had to change it to today. But I'm sure I'm sure you will find it very, very beneficial. And thank you very much for joining us today. I'm not going to say any further. I'm just going to now pass it on to Brother Amjad, who is going to do a presentation on this whole idea of critical thinking, which I would say is something that is very deep rooted in Islamic tradition. But unfortunately, in modern times, we have somewhat lost that unique aspect of our Islamic tradition. So we are going to revive that, inshallah, and we're going to revive it based on Quran and Sunnah. And so I'm going to now ask Brother Amjad to start his presentation, and then after the presentation, we will have questions and answers. So, Assalamu alaikum, Brother Amjad, welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Welcome to a webinar on developing a culture of critical thinking. When I was making my presentation, there was lots of things that were coming to my mind, what to include, what to leave out. It's such an important topic that it's seldom gets talked about. So anyway, I've made an attempt to bring this to the table and to remind people why and how it is part of our tradition and a very important aspect of our deen, which gets overlooked. So critical thinking, what is it, why we do it, how do we do it, and what is produced are some of the things that we're going to be discussing today. The learning outcomes for our session is why we need to be critically thinking, Islamic education concepts, we'll look at a few of those. What is critical thinking? We'll define it. Critical thinking in the Quran, and models of critical thinking will be looked at. I've got 3 models to look at, and we will see which ones are more easier to use in our madrasa settings or classroom settings, and so forth. And if there's time, we'll look at a small scale study, case study as well. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let's go on to the first slide. So the national context, what is it? Religious indoctrination claim. So it is said that faith schools are brainwashing children. So the secular society has been very vocal and very loud when it comes to its, religious schools. Of course, most of the schools in this country initially were Church of England based, but there wasn't the hue and cry that came when Islamic schools started to be established in this country nearly 20 to 30 years ago. And now there's a claim that the faith schools are brainwashing our children, and Han talks about this. Weiner, in his big, massive book on schools, talks about passing on religious belief leads to indoctrination. So that's a big claim against us. It's interesting to see the word indoctrination against the word Quran, because it's anything but indoctrination, in fact. And you will see it, and it's something that Muslims sometimes forget what they have, and what they need to be well versed in. So we'll discuss that aspect of things as well. And of course, there's Ofsted around the corner, and a Telegraph article a couple of years ago, or maybe 18 months ago, I think, in fact, talked about the inspection regime looking at out-of-school provision. And in the title, they talked about Bible classes, but if you read the article, it talked about extremism, you know, in evening out of school provisions and on weekends. And of course, we know that's alluding to our madrasas mainly. They're not worried about extremism with Bible classes, so they just use that euphemistically. So let's have a look then at the local context. Why do we need critical thinking? So the local context as to why we need Islamic schooling first would be more appropriate. And according to the Islamic Educational Trust, in their handbook, they say that secondary school children, they're suffering from frustration, rebellion, and doubts about their own deen, their own way of life. And the children are not willing to accept dogma, orthodoxy unquestioningly. They want to question everything, including obeying authority, because children are unable to relate religion to their daily lives. So there is a big culture clash, and of course, in the context of the country we live in, Islamophobia and negative stereotyping of Islam, it's not surprising at all. According to Khan Chima, when he, living in non-Muslim communities made Muslims turn to Islamic schools so that we could preserve our identity and our practices. And Khan Chima does talk about this, and he states one of the main reasons that Islamic schools and of course madrasas have been established is because the state schools have failed to provide that religious moral education that we so crave as part of our birthright as Muslims, and of course as part of the Islamic tradition. Other reasons that were cited that he cites are, the lack of Quranic studies and Arabic and other relevant community languages and so forth, and of course the concern about single-sex education. So let's have a look now in terms of what I've got on my slide. So Muslim parents feel that the children are caught in this situation of a culture clash, where the ethos of the British state schools and the education policy of the government is inconsistent with their way of life. And Khan Chima does talk about an irrelevant curriculum because it says that it leads to a sense of not belonging and underachievement and low expectations. So what is Islamic education? Believe it or not, we have one, and it's which is contrary to popular thought. In fact, the first ever conference held on education was in Mecca in 1977, where the agreed definition of Islamic education was produced, and I quote, it's the balanced growth of the total personality of man through the training of man's spirit, intellect, and rational self, feelings and bodily senses, and should therefore cater for the growth of man in all aspects. And those aspects are listed: spiritual, intellectual, imaginative, physical, scientific, linguistic, both individually and collectively, and to motivate all these aspects toward goodness. Fascinating that this came out from that conference. And in fact, the interesting thing for me is that if you look at the advent of the national curriculum, and according to the 1988 Education Reform Act, which came about then, it very much reflects this definition of what the national curriculum should be about and contain. I think it's added the word art and music to it, that's all. Okay, this is a hadith that I came across on knowledge, but I wanted to share with you. The week itself is a weak hadith, but the words resonated with me and are so true and so powerful that I thought that I will share this as a slide. And it says, to acquire knowledge, it enables the possessor to distinguish right from wrong. It lights the way to heaven. It's a friend in the desert, our society in solitude, our companion when friendless. It guides us to happiness. It sustains us in misery. It is an ornament amongst friends and an armor against enemies. How beautiful is that as a definition? So comprehensive. I actually love this. Okay, some important Islamic concepts that I'll briefly mention. Here they are. Fitra, of course, translates as the pure state, the state that all children are born in, we know. Amana translates as trust. It's a religious responsibility one holds as a parent or an educator. Tarbiyah, which means to grow, nurture, to increase. It's an essential aim of education. Tadib, refinement of character, morals, social conduct. Equally the aim of education. In fact, when it came to Tadib, there's a beautiful book here. I don't know whether you can see it on Tadib and Akhlaq. I've certainly used this with children, and I certainly recommend that. Tazkiyah, which is the refining of one's spiritual self-discipline, central to holistic education, Islamic education as a whole, isn't it? Purification. Ta'lim, to do with knowledge and so forth. Niyyah, the intention, informs and purposes of learning. Ilm to amal, knowledge to action. It's critical interplay in the learning process, or it should be. Ihsan, excellence that we should be working towards in everything that we do. It defines how a learner should approach their learning. Muhasaba, self-assessment or introspection, which, if you like, self-evaluation, the purpose of evaluation. A lot of Muslim schools have that as part of their behavior policy, for example. Tafakkar, purposeful thinking, the thought process, reflection. It's a critical process in transformative learning. And Tadabbur, which is contemplation or deeper reflection. So critical thinking would apply to all of these concepts and ideas. So what is critical thinking? There is no one definition, but one that is mainly agreed upon is this one. Critical thinking is the asking of systematic questions to formulate reasoning and evidences in order to think, reflect, believe, and act as close as possible to the truth, or in the most logical and just way. And this is from Paul et al. Paul and Elder did a lot of work on critical thinking. This is from their definition. So this slide is part of the research, the empirical research carried out in this country. I've researched this topic myself. So the empirical research on Islamic schools that was carried out by Dr. Shaheen and is reported in his thesis and in his book, talks about, he suggests that foreclosed identities are developing out of the Islamic school setting or the madrasa settings, because part of his research was based on madrasas as well. And this is of great concern because foreclosed means not being able to think, not being able to reflect and explore whilst learning one's faith, indicating lack of critical thinking, which is contrary to the desired aims of Islamic education. And if you remember, the definition of Islamic education was that that apart from just the tarbiyah of the child, the intellectual part of the child's upbringing needs to be nurtured just as much. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam as a critical thinker. Now, Prophet Ibrahim was certainly a critical thinker, but I'll read this to you, and which we all know from the Quran. These ayahs translated say, so when the night covered him with darkness, he saw a star. He said, this is my Lord. But when it set, he said, I like not those that disappear. And when he saw the moon rising, he said, this is my Lord. But when it set, he said, unless my Lord guides me, I will surely be amongst the people who have gone astray. And when he saw the sun rising, he said, this is my Lord. This is greater. But when it set, he said, O my people, indeed I am free from what you associate with Allah. Indeed, I have turned my face towards He who created the heavens and the earth, inclining towards the truth. And I'm not of those who associate others with Allah. So what thought processes do you think Ibrahim alayhi salam is following or going through when he is making those bold statements? Fascinating, fascinating. So critical thinking and dialogue in the Quran. Taken from the Quran, these sentences, do they not reflect on the Quran? Do they not ponder about the Quran? Do they not think? Do they not reason? It is hope that you will think, for those who inquire and question. In fact, Dr. Shaheen in his book, New Directions in Islamic Education, he says that there are more than 650 occasions in the Quran when a thinking or reflective word is mentioned or used. Absolutely incredible. How did we ever overlook it? Let's look at reflection, because the Quran extensively talks about this, the Tadabbur. And this definition by Dewey really exemplifies this in my eyes. It's a state of doubt, hesitation, perplexity, mental difficulty in which thinking originates. And I want you to, it's an act of searching, wanting inquiry to find material that will resolve the doubt, settle and dispose of perplexity. And this is exactly what Ibrahim alayhi salam was doing, wasn't he? In the ayah from the Quran. So the Quranic message thus is that we should seek, we should explore, we should question for greater understanding. And in fact, we need to ignite the true spirit of inquiry that's been missing. Ever since the golden age of Islam, where have we been? And ever since the demise of the Ottoman Empire, and the Muslim world has been colonized, and we are slowly coming out of it. And Faruqi, in his paper, he talks about this, and he says that there's a malaise in the ummah. He uses the word malaise, which is associated with some sort of illness, some sort of discomfort. So we really need to ignite that spirit that we once had. And I think the missing link is that we are not critically thinking. The qualities of critical thinking, disposition, or as Paul and Elder call them, they call them intellectual traits. That if you have open-mindedness, if you're open-minded, fair-minded, you have the propensity to seek reason, you're inquisitive, the desire to be well-informed, you are flexible, You have respect for other viewpoints. You have humility, autonomy, courage, perseverance, empathy and integrity, and confidence in reasoning. Then you can say that you have qualities of critical thinking within you as a person. But if you don't, then these are the sort of things that that this leads to. It leads you to becoming prejudiced, to have overgeneralization, and fall into common fallacies, suffer from self-deception, to be too rigid, and there's narrowness there. There's all the things that we don't want. We don't want to nurture in ourselves, nor those charges, the children that we teach that are in our care. So how do you nurture or develop a culture of critical thinking? So let's explore some models. Now I've chosen 3 for you. I've chosen Bloom's model. I've chosen the another model from the learning developmental model from Plymouth University, and the second model, which is the Paul Elder model. So let's go through that. The learning development model, which is a unidimensional, it's linear, and it uses the process skills of description, analysis, and evaluation. I'll try my best to try to explain this to you. You know, from an online point of view, from a webinar point of view, it's not easy to describe things on a page. When you know, when you're face to face, it's a little easier, but I'll do my best and see how we get on. So this is a model to generate critical thinking and critical thought. So you identify a topic and you put that in the middle. You can think of this like a spider diagram. Could be an essay title, it could be a subtopic, it could be a story from the Quran. You know, that you want to discuss could be, for example, the story of Yusuf. And then you would apply the what, when, who, where, why to the whole story of Yusuf alayhi salam. You could do this in a linear way, of course. Here, like this, it's the same thing, more spread out, with those questions of what, and you know, try to answer the questions on the diagram starting with the what questions, and your answer will be part of an introduction, for example, defining your terms or identifying issues. The who, when, and the where questions generate a descriptive background information, and they will provide the context. It sets the scene of the story of Yusuf, if you like. It's a part of a useful introduction, if that's what you're trying to teach the children. The how requires you know, how takes you from a more descriptive to a more analytical point of view or analytical work. It's the way something operates and works, processes and procedures. The why also moves you into deeper analysis, deeper analytical territory. It gets you to find the reasons, explanation, causes. Think about all the possible questions to do with why. Asking questions of, for example, 2/3 of the way down, we've got what if, moves you into a more evaluative phase of your thinking, helps you to consider possible implications, the results of particular actions, and the so what is the key question here for evaluation. It gets you thinking about values, meaning, significance, and it helps you to discriminate from what is more or what is less important. It helps you to justify your own position, and perhaps discuss implication of what you're of what you've concluded, and what X might you know, take you to recommendations and further predictions that your argument has brought to light, and so forth. So that's your first model that I wanted to discuss. And this should generate critical thinking in your lessons with your students. Another way is model 2. And the Paul Elder thinking framework here is using the elements of reasoning, of thought. Then on to those he applies the both Paul and Elder apply intellectual standards that we'll discuss in a minute, and they give rise to the intellectual traits that I discussed earlier, the dispositions. So let's look at that. It's a little complicated, but I'll try my best to go through this. I've labeled them 1, 2, and 3 because that's how I think is best to explain this to you. So according to the Paul Elder critical thinking framework, where you can think about any subject, content, or a problem in which they want you to improve the quality of their thinking process. You need to go through this, if you like, algorithm. And it starts with number 1, where it talks about the element of reasoning or thought. And Paul Elder, they say that all reasoning has a purpose. All reasoning is an attempt to figure out something, to settle some questions, to solve a problem. All reasoning is done from some point of view. All reasoning is based on data, information, and evidences. All reasoning contains inferences or interpretations. All reason is expressed through and shaped by some concepts or ideas. Or all reasoning leads somewhere, or has implications, and has consequences. And all reasoning is based on some sort of assumptions. So these are his elements of reasoning to which he uses, and these intellectual standards. So those reasonings that I've gone through, whether it's purpose, whether it's the point of view that you're discussing, whether it's the consequences, you've got to then apply how accurate they are, whether they have clarity. For example, in terms of his intellectual standards, in terms of accuracy, how can we check on that? You need to ask yourself, how could we find out if something is true? How can we verify or test it? Whether that point of view or that inference is, information is true or not. In terms of clarity, you need to say, could we elaborate on the information that we have? You could ask the questions, could you illustrate what you mean here? Could you give me an example? So that would bring out the clarity in the thought process. Relevance here means, how does that relate to the problem that we're discussing? How does that bear on the question? How does it help us with the issue? In terms of logic, does this make sense? You need to ask yourself, does the first paragraph agree with the last one? Does what we say follow from the evidences that we have? In terms of precision, we've got, we would ask the questions, could you be more specific, for example? Could you give more details? Could you be more exact? In terms of depth, what factors makes this more difficult? What are the difficulties that we need to deal with? In terms of significance, you might want to say, is this the most important problem to consider, or is there something else? Is this the central idea to focus on, or are we focusing on the wrong things? Which facts are the most important should we be looking at? So in terms of the fairness, is my thinking justifiable? Am I taking account the thinking of other people in terms of bias or unbiased? The breadth looks at, can we look at this from another perspective, or even another point of view? So those intellectual standards, when applied to the elements of reasoning, they give rise to, to the intellectual traits. So consistent application of intellectual standards to the elements of thinking results in intellectual humility or fair-mindedness, confidence in reasoning, intellectual autonomy, empathy, and so forth. So this is what it develops. So that's the Paul Elder model. It's a little more involved, I'd say. So let's swiftly then move on to the third model. Now, which is Bloom's taxonomy. Now this Bloom's taxonomy breaks down the thinking process into 6 levels of thinking and learning. It involves asking relevant questions and moves the learner from low to high levels through of thought by using appropriate descriptive verbs, which are aligned with the levels of Bloom's. And I'll be illustrating that with that in a minute. So it's a cognitive version of how people learn, basically. Starting from the bottom, you slowly, let me just go to it. So you start at the bottom and you slowly work your way to the, you journey to the top where everything gets more complex, especially your thinking skills. And at the top, you could say you have acquired expertise to say run a debate, or to educate people, or to hold your own in an argument, if that's your interest or your intent. For example, if you were to argue, is Islam the right religion for mankind? Can you defend it? Can you defend that premise? And you can, you need to be quite high up in that taxonomy, in that pyramid, to be able to successfully provide the reasons and the arguments, both sides, to come out successful. So this model here by far is the most commonly used in classrooms today, up and down the country. The basic, a brief explanation of the different levels is the following. The bottom one is more concrete. It's to do with knowledge and remembering, recalling basic facts and concepts of your concepts of interest. For example, you might want to say, ask, which is the biggest city in the United Kingdom? What is 9 times 9? These are fact-based. Which prophet in the Quran could talk to the animals? It's to do with recall. It's basic facts and concepts. The next level up is to do with comprehension or understanding, being able to combine like terms, combine basic information. For example, I teach maths, or that's my background, has been teaching maths in schools. And I would say, how can you combine 2 congruent isosceles triangles to form a rhombus? And, do you understand that? A rhombus is a squashed square, if you like. So to use, if I was an English teacher, I might say, how is the colon, and used differently to a semicolon or an apostrophe, and so forth. So for that, you need to really get your understanding cap on. Application here is to use and apply knowledge from previous levels to solve problems in new situations. For example, how would you apply the rules of tajweed to a new surah that you haven't learned before? So that would move you to a more difficult level. And then analysis is breaking up new information into parts to identify reasons, causes, motives, also maybe find evidences to support your view, and so forth. Let's take the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, for example. Why was that good for Muslims eventually, but initially it seemed like a sellout for Muslims? So you can discuss the Treaty of Hudaybiyah at different levels, of course. At the level of analysis, this is what you'll be discussing. If you're a science teacher in a classroom, you might want to ask the questions, why are dolphins also called mammals? Because we are, as human beings, are mammals. So for that, you need to be able to analyze it, break things down into parts, and so forth. To be, evaluative, is to do with critique, to be able to justify. These are the sort of verbs that are used. Hold debates, to be able to assess, defend, and so forth. Synthesis is the top level, is to do with combining different types of information to form alternative solutions, to design, to compose. Those sort of things come to mind. And as I said before, there are certain verbs are aligned to each level, and I'll share that with you here. So you've got this situation where you've got Bloom's taxonomy helps students to develop their critical thinking skills by moving up that pyramid from knowledge and knowledge and remembering, right up to the analysis, evaluative, and the creative. So it's to do with higher, to move from basic concrete thinking to higher order, more abstract cognitive thought processes. The best education is where we are able to challenge our pupils, our students, whether they're in a school setting, in a madrasa setting, whether we're teaching the Quran, whether we are teaching the Salah, whatever we are teaching, this is what it's about. Bloom's helps to helps educators to set targets. It also helps to differentiate, and differentiation is really important in education. In fact, what comes to mind is Imam Ghazali. People forget his treatise on education, where he says, don't give milk to someone who can eat meat. And the context is of course, education. And vice versa, don't give them meat when they should be drinking milk. If there's someone is, at a lower level, then that's where you should be basing your questioning and slowly moving them up like a staircase, up the levels of Bloom's. And so to make life easier for teachers, when they're utilizing Bloom's in the classroom, these descriptive verbs have been aligned with each level. As you move from from knowledge concrete base to a more evaluative, high order thinking, which resides at the top levels. So let's have a look. I've got another fuller descriptive verb table here for you, which takes into account digital things like tweeting as well, or Googling. That's all part of it. You may be able to see those words that appear. So you can look at that at your leisure. Let's move on to this. So I now want to look at a case study quickly. We can so I want to now illustrate using the model 3, which is Bloom's, on some research that was done, which I want to share with you by Sheikh Abdul Rahman, who's a teacher. I think he's the deputy head at an Islamic schools and in charge of Islamic education there, and has done a lot of work, and has worked in a few Islamic schools. And in his research, in his dissertation, Sheikh Abdul Rahman, who's a Medina graduate, and he did his master's in the UK. And for those masters, which is based on the modern pedagogy through the prism of Islamic education philosophy, with a specific focus on Bloom's taxonomy. So he applied Bloom's on Salah and Quran as an example, and this is what he says, and I'm sharing that with you. And he says, I shall take two very common examples, teaching Salah, as well as how to study the Noble Quran in light of the aforementioned theory, i.e. Bloom's. So if you remember, the bottom level was remembering. And if it's Salah, it's being able to perform Salah technically and recall the required du'as. supplications. And if you're teaching the Quran, it means being able to recite the Quran with tajweed from memory or from the book without knowing its meanings. And as you move up that staircase, the pyramid, the next level is understanding. In terms of salah, what does that mean? It means comprehending the purpose and functions of salah, but lacking in correct performance, i.e., you don't have khushu, which is the focus of the heart and body. And in terms of the Quran, it's comprehending the meanings of the Quran in terms of tafsir, and perhaps having memorized a great deal of the noble book, but unable to put this knowledge into action, i.e., it hasn't changed your character in the way that it should. You are on the journey of change. When you're applying it to salah at the next level of blooms, it's having the ability to perform salah correctly, fulfilling all the pillars, all the sharuts, the conditions, the obligations, the rules of an Islamic prayer in any given circumstance. If, for example, while traveling or during heavy rain, and hence special rules that come into place, and you're aware of those, and that you can apply them. In terms of the Quran, it's having the ability to take the Quran as an ultimate guide in life by deriving the correct procedure in any given situations directly from the noble book. So that's quite a high level now when you can do that, as you can see. So what does it mean in terms of analysis and analyzing? I'll share that with you as well. In terms of salah, it's the ability to reflect on the performance of each component of salah in order to identify your shortcomings or the shortcomings and faults during prayer, followed by the correct procedures to rectify your mistakes in the proper way. In terms of the Quran, it's the ability to ponder over the ayat of the Quran in order to find out connections and parables, elevating one's imans, your faith, and your yaqeen, which is your conviction. And in terms of evaluating, which is second from the top, in terms of salah, it's the competence of judging in matters of salah in special circumstances based on solid arguments derived from acceptable Sharia sources. It's a level of ijtihad, very high level. And few scholars reach that level, as we know. And of course, in terms of the Quran now, competence in judging in matters of tafsir, abrogating ayats of the or qiraat in order to derive explicit rulings. Level of ijtihad in tafsir is there as well. And in terms of creating or designing, which is the top level, what does it mean? So as Sheikh Abdul Rahman, he says, inventing a new form of worship is not allowed in Islam. We all know that. However, finding a new method to improve the performance in prayer or hifz, which is memorization of the Noble Quran, is possible and is allowed. And this may include innovative schemes of hifz or techniques for improving khushu in salah. For example, visualization of paradise and hell, which was reported to have been done by some early Muslims. So I'll end there because I've been through quite a lot in a very short space of time. And I'm aware there'll be a lot going on in your brains about this. And just to conclude as to why, what I've taken you through. So we've looked at the contexts of local and regional, countrywide contexts. We've looked at Islamic concepts. We've looked at what critical thinking is in terms of definition. We've looked at some things to do with critical thinking in the Quran and why it is so important, specifically with the Jews' definition of reflection and how Ibrahim alayhi salam was definitely reflecting in his thought process and using critical thinking. And then we've looked at 3 models of critical thinking. So that's the end of my presentation to you. And I'm sure you'll have a lot going on in your brain. So basically, I just want to say that critical thinking, it makes us, the essence of critical thinking is asking those systematic questions to formulate reasonings, we said, and evidences, so that we can reflect, believe, and as close as possible to what the truth is in the most logical and ethical way. And that was the definition given to us. So critical thinking is important in all our lives, because whether you're an individual, whether you're part of a family, as a community, even in government, because it gives us boundaries for what is right and what is wrong, and how to act rationally. It gives us progress over regression. It gives us benefit over any harm, success over failure, in my eyes, flexibility over rigidity, iman over kufr, makes you non-bias over bias as much as possible, if you can. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair for listening.
Barakallahu feek. Thank you very much, Brother Amjad. What an insightful session. And you covered a huge amount within a very short period of time. Critical thinking, subhanallah.